Hello and welcome to the next episode of the UiPath Basics course. Today we will cover variables and arguments, essential elements in any automation process. I will show you how to store and process data using variables, as well as how to transfer that data between different parts of the process using arguments, which are often used in more complex automations. Alright, let's start by creating a new process. We will name it Variables and Arguments, and click Create. Great! Now that we have the main UiPath Studio window open, let's begin with variables. A variable is an element that stores data while our robot runs. To create a variable, go to the Variables section at the bottom of the UiPath window. Here we can add a new variable, give it a name and select the appropriate type. Let's create our first variable called customer name. In variable type we can select the data type, and in scope we define the scope where it will be stored. Now let's assign a value to this variable. We will select the assign activity, then enter the name of our variable, customer name. Since it's a string, we will type a name like Jan in quotation mark. Now let's use this variable to create a personalized message by combining multiple variables into a single text string. To do this, we will create another variable using the assign activity. If we don't want to create the variable directly from the variables panel at the bottom, we can also create it within the assign activity by using the shortcut Ctrl+K. Here we can type the name of our variable. Let's call it, for example, greeting. As you can see, the variable immediately appears below, and we can assign it a value like hello, followed by space. Now, let's use concatenation to display a text string that combines these variables. So we can type our first variable, add a plus sign, and then the second variable. We can always add any character sequence, such as an exclamation mark, by typing it in quotation marks. We will use the write line activity here. Let's run the process and see what appears in the output panel. As you can see, the output panel shows Hello Jan, exactly what we entered in the write line activity. The first variable, greeting, contained hello, the second variable, customer name, containing Jan, and the character sequence, exclamation mark, that we added. Before we proceed to arguments, it's helpful to briefly explain workflows, which help us organize our automations in UiPath. A workflow can be thought of as a separate unit of task that performs a specific function, such as generating a message, sending an email, or processing data. We can split a complex project into smaller parts and implement them in separate workflows, which makes organizing and transferring data much easier. Let's create a separate workflow. We will create a new sequence, right-click, and select Extract as Workflow. We can name it, for example, Send Email Sequence. Once we create it, we see in the main window that we now have an activity that triggers a separate file with a distinct workflow. In this case, a separate sequence. As you can see, we can now add a completely new sequence to perform specific actions. Now, each workflow can have its own variables, but if we want to transfer data between different workflows, we use arguments. We create in, out, and in and out arguments to pass input data, output data, or data that can be modified during processing. Let's create arguments to pass the client's name to the process that will generate the message. Arguments created within a process can be transferred to other workflows, like send email sequence. So let's create an in argument to pass the client's name and an out arguments to return the result. We go to the Arguments tab, name the argument in customer name, and select the direction in. Let's place a message within this new workflow to display which argument we received. In this case, we will use in customer name as the argument. Now, let's pass this argument by clicking Import Arguments. Here, we can either assign a text value to our argument or use a variable. Let's go with the customer name variable. We save and run the process. Let's check the output panel. As you can see, customer name Jan appears, meaning that the Jan variable was passed into the new workflow via the argument. Now, let's use an out argument named out customer name with the out direction. We will use the assign activity to give it a new value. This time not Jan but Paul. Returning to the main sequence, we import the arguments again and assign the out argument to the customer name variable. After completing this sequence, let's copy the WriteLine activity to check how our concatenation will look now. Let's run the process. In the output panel, we see Hello Jan, followed by the in argument Jan passed to the sequence as customer name Jan. Finally, after finishing the sequence, the message Hello Paul appears, even though we used the same variable initially assigned to Jan, but now modified to Paul by the send email sequence. Now, we still have the in and out argument type to cover, so let's create one. Let's first go to the main sequence and create an integer variable named counter, assigning in the initial value of 1. Now, in the send email sequence, let's create an argument called IO counter with the direction in and out. We save the workflow and click Import argument, assigning to the IO counter to the counter variable. Now we have created a variable named counter, which we will pass to our sequence, modify and then return with a different value. Let's check that by using WriteLine. Within the sequence, we will need to change this argument, so let's add assign activity and we will set IO counter to IO counter plus 5, for example. Alright, let's save and check our automation results. In the output panel, you can see that counter initially had a value of 1. After the sequence, it changed to 6. This entire operation was done with a single in and out argument, so there was no need for two separate arguments to get the updated value from the sequence. Alright, today we learned how to use variables and arguments in UiPath. We covered the different arguments type in, out and out, which allow us to manage data effectively between different parts of the process. We also used concatenation to create a personalized message. In the next video, we will cover loops in UiPath, which will allow us to automate larger datasets. Thanks for watching and see you in the next episode. Take care, goodbye!